In today's video, we're talking about a special set of criminal charges that exist in Arizona known as sexual offenses. They're governed under the Arizona Revised Statutes, Chapter 14, Title 13, Chapter 14. And before we can really dive into them, we're going to be talking about crimes like sexual abuse, sexual conduct with a minor, crimes like molestation. We need to know how certain definitions work in order to understand those other offenses. So today we're going to look at the definitions portion of Chapter 14 of Title 13, and I have three different main topics here that I want to discuss. These are things that we see frequently scattered throughout the other charges. So if you want to look at all of the definitions, you're going to go to A.R.S. 13-1401. You'll see a list of other definitions, but the most important that I want to review today in this video are these three. Sexual contact. We're going to talk about what sexual contact means, what position of trust means, that specific language, position of trust, and then finally, what without consent means. So when we see this type of language elsewhere in other statutes, what does it really mean? We look to the definitions. So let's start at the top. Sexual contact. What is sexual contact? Most people have a general idea of what that is, but the law is very specific. When you're talking about criminal charges and severe penalties, you have to be black and white. So the law is defining sexual contact as any direct or indirect touching, fondling, manipulating any part of the genitals or female breast or anus by any part of the body or an object. So you can see here it's extremely broad. Basically any contact with genitals, breasts, nipples, anus, vulva, any of those things is going to be considered sexual contact. It does not include things that a reasonable person would expect to be done under caretaking responsibilities. So let's say somebody's incapacitated, they need to have parts of their body cleaned, they have a caretaker who goes in and does that for them. That's not going to be considered sexual contact, primarily because there's really no sexual motive there, but it is contact that might involve their genitals, and so it doesn't necessarily, it technically falls within that particular purview of that, but because it's not sexual in nature, so therefore the law specifically excludes that from the definition of sexual contact. Next, we're talking about a position of trust. So this is more relevant to crimes that are involving minors, so sexual conduct with a minor or molestation. And here we're going to talk about a relationship between the person who is alleged to have committed the crime and the minor, the person who's under the age of 18. And it says that a position of trust will impose some special penalties because the law is considering the person to be exploiting that position of trust. And so what we need to do is make sure we know what those positions are. The law is pretty clear about it. So first, we see that a parent, a step-parent, an adoptive parent, a guardian, a foster parent, anybody in that position is going to be considered to be in a position of trust. Same with a teacher. So a school teacher is going to be considered to be in a position of trust. So if that teacher is alleged to have done something that would be considered a sex offense, they're going to have some additional hurdles to jump through because of the fact they're in a position of trust. So that also applies to coaches, instructors, whether they are an employee of a school, whether they're an employee of some organization, or whether they're just a volunteer. If they are going to be considered and seen as a coach or an instructor, that is also going to be considered a position of trust. And finally, clergy, priests, pastors, anybody who is religiously affiliated with an organization who may be counseling or mentoring or advising somebody who's part of their congregation is also going to be considered to be in a position of trust. Lastly, the law says that any person who's engaged in a romantic or a sexual relationship with a parent or a guardian or a parent figure, essentially everybody who's also in this line. So somebody who's having a romantic relationship or a sexual relationship with a step-parent, adoptive parent, foster parent or something is also going to be within that circle of trust. So they're going to be considered to be in a position of trust if they're alleged to have done some sort of misconduct that's a sexual offense. They'll be considered to be in a position of trust. That is also defined in under this portion of the statutes. And finally, we want to talk about what is considered to be without consent. So without consent, there's certain examples of that. Somebody clearly saying no or stop or I don't want that to happen. That would be engaging. If you continue to engage in that, that would be without their consent. There's other ways that without consent can be applied. So we'll talk about it. So number one, it's basically the first example that I just gave. It's somebody who's coerced by an immediate or a threatened use of force in order to get that person to engage in some sort of conduct. So that would be coercion without consent. It's also considered without consent when a person is incapable of consenting. So here we have the law. It's actually a pretty long paragraph, but the long and short of it is, if a person has a mental defect, if they're not mentally capable of understanding the nature of what's happening to them, they just don't understand the sexual nature of it, they don't understand that they have the right to refuse to engage in that conduct, if they're mentally deficient in some sort of genetically or due to trauma or due to something that would basically impede their ability to consent, that's going to be considered without consent.